Ely, Nevada, December 4, 1907. 7 miles west of town, at the Alpha Shaft of the Giroux Consolidated Copper Mine, the ground gave way, not at the surface, but deep inside the shaft, above the 600-foot level. Rock and timber came down into the workings below. 2 men died in the collapse itself. Below the slide, sealed off from the surface by tons of broken rock, several more men were still alive. At the 1,000-foot level, a fifth of a mile under the desert. Nobody on top knew that. Not at first. Then, through the wreckage, came a sound, metal striking metal. Someone below was hitting a pipe. That pipe, 6 inches of iron, originally run down the shaft to feed a pump, became the only thread connecting 2 worlds. Through it, crews on the surface sent air. They sent food and water, a little each day. And they discovered they could send something else down it too. A telephone line. For the men trapped below, the pipe was rationing and darkness and the sound of rock still settling somewhere above them. For the men digging from above, it was 4-hour shifts around the clock, through ground that had already proven it could give way without warning. Racing an unknown clock, because nobody could be sure exactly how long a sealed man could last, or exactly how much more rock might come down before they reached him. 46 days later they found out. And if you're the kind of person who wants to see how a story like this actually ends, not the clean version, the real one, stay with us. Because the men digging didn't know how it would end either, and neither did the men underground. To understand December 4th, 1907, you have to understand what the Alpha Shaft actually was and how it got that deep. Eastern Nevada's Robinson Mining District, the ground around what became Ely, had been prospected on and off since 1868, but for most of the 19th century it amounted to very little. A handful of small silver claims, a fluctuating population, and no railroad. That changed at the turn of the century, when engineers began taking the district's low-grade copper seriously instead of chasing silver. 2 men mattered most to what would become the Giroux operation specifically. J.A. Snedeker and Joseph L. Giroux, who arrived in the district in 1890 and 1900 respectively, and began quietly bonding claims around a hill called Pilot Knob. By 1902, the Pilot Knob Copper Company they'd formed had sunk 8 shafts as deep as 330 feet and blocked out real ore in ground called Taylor, Pilot Knob, Old Glory, and Brooks. In 1903, the operation reorganized as the Giroux Consolidated Mines Company, and the Alpha Shaft, along with the Brooks and Bunker Hill workings, was started the following year, in 1904. From there, the shaft's growth is documented almost year by year in the mine's own technical record. Ore appeared on the 700-foot level of the Alpha Mine in 1906. Over the following 18 months, exploration pushed the shaft down to the 1,000-foot level. By August 1907, 4 months before the collapse, the mine was shipping real tonnage from that depth, 210 carloads of ore running 12 to 14% copper, sent to the Garfield smelter at Salt Lake City. That is not a marginal operation. That is a working mine, proving out one of its best levels yet in the exact months leading up to the disaster. This was also, not coincidentally, the peak of a genuine boom. A trade publication called The Mining Investor wrote in December 1906 that Ely was astonishing the copper miners of America, and that ground inside the district's proven zone was almost impossible to buy at any price short of 6 figures. The Nevada Northern Railway had reached E in September 1906, tying the district to the transcontinental line and making large-scale shipping possible for the first time. Ely went, in the space of about 2 years, from a stage stop to a boom town. Then, in the autumn of 1907, the boom hit a wall that had nothing to do with the mine itself. A national financial panic swept the country that fall, and it cut through the smaller mining outfits across Nevada hard. Some companies failed outright. Giroux did not. It kept developing the Alpha Shaft through the panic, kept shipping ore, kept pushing deeper. What kind of work was it, specifically, to be a miner at the Alpha Shaft's 1,000-foot level in 1907? It meant descending a fifth of a mile inside a vertical shaft timbered with wood, not steel or concrete standard practice for the era. It meant working ore faces lit by carbide lamps, in air that had to be actively managed. In rock that mining engineers of the day understood in principle, but could not predict with certainty in any given cubic yard. There was no federal mine safety agency with binding authority in 1907. That framework was decades away. Ground support, ventilation, and rescue capability were company decisions, shaped by cost and by whatever experience the company already had, which, for GRU in December 1907, was not yet very much. The names that survive in the newspaper coverage of the entombment are Bailey, Brown, and MacDonald. The three most consistently named across sources, though other accounts suggest a fourth man may have been trapped as well. Two of them, Brown and MacDonald, are separately described in a contemporary account as inveterate smokers, a detail worth holding on to, because it becomes one of the sharper, more human details of what the entombment actually felt like from the inside. That is the world the Alpha Shaft's morning crew walked into on December 4th, 1907. A mine 4 months past its best production yet, in a boomtown riding out a national financial panic, sunk a fifth of a mile into ground that had never yet seriously failed, right up until the moment, above the Beshal, 600-foot level that it did. The most detailed technical source available, a 1917 government survey of the Ely district, states plainly, in its year-by-year mine history, that on December 4th, 1907, the Alpha Shaft gave way above the 600-foot level and several miners were imprisoned on the 1,000-foot level for a period of 46 days. That is specific and it's consistent with every other independent source. But earlier in that same government report, in a separate summary passage, the same events are described differently. A serious cave-in in April 1907. Several miners lost. 3 rescued after more than a month. Food conveyed through a 6-inch pump line. April, not December. This is very likely an error inside a single report written a decade after the fact. The more detailed, date-anchored timeline elsewhere in the same document says December, and every outside source agrees with December. But it's a real discrepancy inside a real primary source, and it doesn't get quietly smoothed over here. What actually happened, as best the converging evidence allows us to reconstruct it. Sometime on December 4th, 1997, the ground failed above the 600-foot level of the Alpha Shaft. Rock and broken timber came down into the shaft below that point. 2 men working in that stretch of the mine were killed in the collapse itself. Below the debris, at the 1,000-foot level, the same level the mine had just proven out, with 210 carloads of high-grade ore 4 months earlier, several more men were cut off. The best-sourced figure is 3, Bailey, Brown, and MacDonald. One source says 4 men were trapped. Another says 3. 3 names survive clearly in the record. A fourth trapped man may or may not have existed depending on which account you trust. The men below had no way out under their own power. What they had was a 6-inch pipe originally run down the shaft as a pump line, that had survived the collapse intact enough to still function as a channel between their pocket of the mine and the surface. Air moved through it, and the men found they could use it for more than air. According to a period newspaper account of the ordeal, the surface crews managed to fit up a telephone alongside the food pipe, so the conversation and music were kept up daily on the line, even while the men remained sealed below. That detail changes the texture of what those 46 days actually were. This was not silence punctuated by taps on metal. For at least part of the ordeal, the trapped men could talk to the surface, could hear voices, could apparently even have music sent down to them. The same account preserves one more detail worth sitting with directly. Brown and MacDonald were, in the words of the period report, inveterate smokers, and being denied matches or any open flame for fear of setting off an explosion in the sealed workings was described as the hardest part of their imprisonment. 6 weeks in the dark, rationed on food and air, and the detail that stayed with the reporter covering it was 2 men craving tobacco they could never safely have. On the surface, the response was sustained and expensive. Crews worked the debris in 4-hour shifts, paid $5 each at a total cost the mine's owners later put at roughly $200 a day. A headline from December 29, 1907, more than 3 weeks into the ordeal read, "Fear a slide will end the entombed the ordeal. Read fear a slide will end the entombed men's lives." That fear was not rhetorical. The same ground that had already failed once remained unstable through the entire rescue, meaning every foot of progress the diggers made carried a real chance of triggering a second collapse on top of the first. this time with rescuers inside it, as well as the men they were trying to reach. Day after day, into January. That was the entire shape of the story. A pipe carrying air, food, water, occasional conversation, and once, apparently, music. A surface crew inching forward through rock that had already shown what it could do, and no way for anyone on either end of that pipe to know for certain how the story was going to end. By mid-January 1908, 6 weeks had passed. In the broader context of American mining that winter, 6 weeks was itself a kind of statement. 2 days after the Alpha collapse began, the Monongah mining disaster in West Virginia killed as many as 500 men in a single explosion. 2 weeks after that, the Dar mine disaster in Pennsylvania killed 239 more. Set against that backdrop, a run of American mining catastrophes piling up almost weekly through December 1907. A story about men still possibly alive after 6 weeks sealed underground was not the way these stories were supposed to go. The clearest single human detail to survive from the final days of the ordeal is this. Shortly before the rescue was completed, a letter addressed to Brown was sent down the pump shaft to him. It told him that his mother had died in California while he had been entombed. He learned of her death from inside the mine, through the same 6-inch line that had been keeping him alive, before he had even been brought back to the surface to grieve her in the ordinary way. Whatever relief came with rescue, it arrived for at least one of these men already carrying a loss he'd had to absorb alone, in the dark, before he ever saw daylight again. The rescue itself was completed on or around January 19th or 20th, 1908. Sources differ by a single day. Contemporary coverage recorded it plainly. 3 Nevada miners, Bailey, Brown, and McDonald, were rescued from the shaft of the Giroux mine, Ely, Nevada, after what one report called 46 days, another 47. They came out largely intact. A period summary described the men as little or worse for their 6 weeks' captivity, striking, understated language for an ordeal that had already claimed 2 of their co-workers in the initial collapse, and that a regional headline, weeks earlier, had bluntly labeled their 1,000-foot grave. By the 3rd and 4th week of the entombment, public coverage had shifted from rescue in progress to something closer to a death watch. The language of grave, not shaft, not chamber, tells you that. The diggers kept working their 4-hour shifts anyway because a $200 a day rescue effort does not simply stop on the strength of a headline, however grim. What we do not have is a verbatim first-person account from Bailey, Brown, or McDonald describing what those 46 days felt like from the inside. No surviving interview transcript turned up in the available record. What we have instead is what the record actually preserved. The telephone and the music, the craving for tobacco they couldn't have. The letter about a mother's death arriving through a pump line before her son ever saw the sun again, and 3 men walking out of a hole in the ground that half the mining camp west had already started calling their grave. The Alpha shaft was repaired by May 1908, and sinking continued, down to 1,200 feet by the end of that year, where the mine found more of the same oxidized ore that had made the 1,000-foot level so productive before the collapse. Giroux kept growing. In 1909, the company began sinking an entirely new working shaft, simply called the Giroux shaft, designed from the start to be one of the largest and deepest in the district. By 1911, it had reached 1,440 feet, with connections tied into the older Alpha workings on 3 separate levels, and a new tunnel pushed 420 feet toward the Alpha shaft from the 1,400-foot level. The company's own annual reports from this period describe a mine actively expanding, with tens of millions of tons of copper-bearing ore blocked out across the property. On August 23rd or 24th, 1911, the 2 best-sourced accounts disagree by a day. Fire broke out in that new shaft, at the station of the 1,000-foot level. The cause was never definitively established. The best working theory, laid out in a contemporary technical account of the disaster, 2 men passing from the 770-foot level to the 1,400-foot level had likely stopped at the 1,000-foot level and left behind a lit candle snuff, which is believed to have ignited nearby timbering. That is a theory, not a confirmed fact. The report itself frames it as thought and believed and states directly that the cause of the fire remains unknown. What is not in doubt is what the fire did once it started. It tore through the 1,000-foot level station and much of the ore pocket there, and spread to the 770-foot and 1,200-foot levels as well. Miners at the 1,300-foot level, roughly 400 feet deeper than the fire's origin, had no 6-inch pipe this time, no 6 weeks to wait for rescue. Their only route to the surface was the cage elevator, rising directly through the section of shaft where the fire was burning. They took it anyway because the alternative, staying below, meant certain death by suffocation or flame regardless. The cage reached the 1,200-foot level and ran into the fire directly. Several men left it there and tried to walk out through the old Alpha workings instead, hoping to climb free through a shaft the fire hadn't reached. It did not go well for most of them. The cage tender, the man operating the elevator, tried to ride it up and fell 15 feet below the collar. One man riding the loaded cage up from the 1,400-foot level was pulled off during hoisting, apparently by a manila signal cord that had already been weakened by fire and snapped when someone pulled it to signal the hoist operator. He fell down the shaft, entangled in the burned cord. 2 more men were killed by gas or flame while still on the cage as it was hauled up through the fire zone. The 5 men who left the cage at the 1,200-foot level to try the old Alpha shaft fared worst of all. 3 of them, named in the period report as Wilhelmy, Gilmore, and Odolovich, were overcome by gas as they tried to climb out on the Alpha's ladders. Their bodies were found at different points in the shaft. Wilhelmy at the 400-foot level, Gilmore's body recovered at 600 feet, Odolovich found face down at a bulkhead. 2 more men from that group were found dead clinging to the ladders where they had been suffocated. 3 other men involved in the escape were burned but survived. 7 men died in total. 2 or 3 more survived with serious injuries depending on the account. The period investigation raised a specific, unresolved question worth sitting with rather than answering falsely, whether fire doors, had they existed at the level where the fire started, might have contained it before it spread through 3 separate levels of the shaft, and whether turning on the mine sprinkler system during the fire may have actually reversed the air currents, inadvertently pushing smoke and combustion gases directly into the Alpha shaft, the very route the 5 men were trying to use to escape. The report calls this not proved but possible. Nobody in 1911 or since appears to have settled the question either way. The mine was flooded in the fire's aftermath, and the water was not removed until February 1912, more than 6 months later. If you'd been offered work in that same shaft in the spring of 1912, knowing everything that had already happened there twice, would you have taken it? What would a mining family in 1912 have weighed against a paycheck? It would be simple to say the mine was reopened in February 1912 and leave it there. The primary record doesn't support that framing. What the historical record actually states is this. The Giroux shaft was unwatered, meaning the floodwater from the 1911 fire was pumped out in February 1912. But, in the report's own words, little or no work was done in the way of further development after that. The water was gone. Active mining did not simply resume. Then, on October 2nd, 1912, a strike among the mine workers led to the pumps being shut down entirely, and water again took possession of the workings below the 1,000-foot level, undoing, in effect, the pumping work of 8 months earlier. That is a genuinely different story than a simple repair and return to work. It's a story about a mine standing partially drained but largely idle for most of 1912, caught between the aftermath of a fatal fire and a labor dispute that put it back underwater before serious work ever resumed. Why the company waited, and whether the strike had anything to do with conditions at the mine itself. So soon after 7 men had died there, the available record doesn't say. That is a genuine gap, not a place to improvise an answer. The mine did not stay idle forever. By 1913, Giroux was shipping ore again, 230 tons at nearly 9% copper that year, and substantially more from its other workings on the property. That same year, the Giroux Consolidated Mines Company itself ceased to exist as an independent operator. It was absorbed into a larger entity formed specifically to merge Giroux with several neighboring operations. The district consolidated around it in the years that followed. Eventually, by the middle of the 20th century, essentially all of it, Giroux's ground included, had passed into the hands of the Kennecott Copper Corporation, which would go on to make Ailey's Copper District one of the largest in American history. Set the two disasters against that larger arc and a pattern becomes visible that neither event shows on its own. In 1907, ground the company had just proven at its best producing level failed catastrophically, trapped 3 or 4 men for 6 weeks, and killed 2 others outright, and the company kept sinking that same shaft deeper within months of the rescue. In 1911, a much larger, newer, more expensive shaft, built at a cost of over $250,000, caught fire at almost exactly the same depth, the 1,000-foot level that had failed in 1907, and killed 7 men in the time it took a burning elevator cage to reach the surface. That is not proof of negligence. There's no evidence here of what safety measures Giroux did or didn't have in place. What it is proof of is a documented pattern, a specific depth, in a specific shaft system that failed twice in 4 years in 2 entirely different ways, at a company that kept mining through both. So what was found 1,000 feet down when they finally broke through? Not an object, not a sealed chamber holding some forgotten secret. What the rescue crews found at the end of that 6-inch pipe, after 46 days, was 3 men, Bailey, Brown, and McDonald, and possibly a 4th the record can't fully confirm, who had rationed food and water sent down a pump line, kept in touch with the surface by an improvised telephone that once carried music into a sealed section of Nevada rock, and enjoyed a craving for tobacco they weren't allowed to satisfy, the fear of striking a spark that could kill them. One of them learned his mother had died before he ever saw daylight again. That is the actual discovery, not a mystery object, a genuine anomaly in the mining disaster record of its era, at a moment when American mines were killing men by the hundreds almost weekly. A regional paper had already called this shaft their 1,000-foot grave before the rescue was complete. It wasn't. But the Fuller record refuses to let their survival stand alone as the whole story. 4 years later, at almost exactly the same depth, in a shaft built specifically to be safer and more capable than the one before it, fire did what the 1907 collapse hadn't. It killed 7 men in the time it took a burning elevator cage to climb 1,000 feet. Named men: Willemy, Gilmore, Odolovich, and 4 others whose stories survive in less detail, died on ladders, in a burning cage, entangled in a signal cord that fire itself had already weakened. And in the aftermath, the mine sat partially flooded and largely idle for most of 1912, caught between an unresolved fire investigation and a labor strike, before finally returning to production and, within a year, disappearing altogether into a larger company. What this discovery ultimately shows isn't a single tidy lesson. It's 2 outcomes the same shaft system was capable of producing within 4 years of each other, a rescue against odds nobody expected to beat, and a fire that gave 7 men no odds to beat at all. Both are equally real. Neither cancels the other out. The Alpha and Giroux shafts at Kimberly, Nevada are largely gone from public memory now, folded into the much larger story of the Copper District that grew up around them. But for 46 days in the winter of 1907, a 6-inch pipe was the only thing standing between 3 known men and a headline that very nearly came true. And 4 years later, at the same depth, no pipe existed to save the next 7. If you want to follow another investigation where the evidence matters as much as the question, the next one is waiting.